Up in the sky. It's a bird. Yes, it's a bird.
Thought this was the flying video? Ha! Let's talk about birds.
Bird up.
The original Gen 1 games had an unused 16th type, bird, which wasn't found on any natural Pokémon. Natural being the key word here. This was the type of the infamous glitch Pokémon Missingno, which was bird/normal type. Is this a bird? Apparently yes. So to you, my dear viewer, here's our leading question for today. What do you think happened to the bird type? Just a heads up, this video is going to be talking a lot about data. Now, it isn't too difficult to assume that bird and flying are somehow related. After all, when it comes to flying animals, birds are what spring to mind for most of us. Unless you are Australian, in which case, for you, birds are flightless and also beat you in a war at one time. You guys are never living that down. So a logical assumption is that sometime during development, bird was abandoned and replaced with flying. This assumption is correct, but there are a few oddities which make this not a perfect answer. The curious thing is, flying was created before bird, implying that flying wasn't created to be a replacement, but that both were created with the intent of coexisting together. Types in Pokemon's data are organized with index numbers. In Gen 1's data specifically, IDs 0 to 8 were assigned to the physical damage types, and IDs 20 and above were assigned to the special damage types. The in-between IDs, 9 to 19, were physical damage types set with neutral interactions. That means they would deal neutral damage to and receive neutral damage from all types, including Ghost. This is a common practice used for reserving ID numbers in data. By filling these rows with junk placeholder data, the IDs can be kept aside in case they might add new physical types later in development or in future games. I myself also did this for a previous game project in a previous company. Don't tell anybody I showed you this, by the way. Back when the game was still early in development, its many Excel spreadsheets were set up with numerous rows of empty zeros. Each row's ID number represents a different monster, skill, character, map, or whatever that datasheet controls. Over time, those reserved rows would gradually have their cells filled with proper data as various monsters, characters, and skills were designed. This can be mildly confusing when applied to numerous different datasheets, but don't worry, it isn't too bad once you get the hang of it. Anyways, this practice of ID reservation would later prove useful for Game Freak, as new physical types would get added in the sequels, under the reserved IDs 9 and 19, being the Steel type and Curses ? Type. This is also the state bird found itself in. It had neutral interactions with all other types because its original type interaction data was wiped and set to default values. In other words, it was a type which was reverted to a placeholder state. Right then, my dear viewer, the stage is set and the facts are in full view. Time to answer the question, what happened to bird? Let's proceed through the flow of logic and reasoning. No games now. The important thing to note are the ID positions of bird and flying. Bird is set to ID value 6, just before bug and ghost, while flying is set to ID value 2, just after normal and fighting. The positions of these two IDs imply two conclusions. Conclusion the first. The flying type came into existence before the bird type. The order of IDs tell us that the flying type had data set up at a very early stage into the type system's development, implying it was designed before bird, which had its type data come later. An alternative but slightly less likely possibility is that the first 7, at least, physical types and an unknown number of special types all had their data created at the same time. In that case, their numerical order aside from normal would have just been assigned arbitrarily. Regardless, in both scenarios, it is impossible for bird to have been designed before flying. At the absolute earliest, bird would have been conceptualized at the same approximate point as flying, but never before. Conclusion the second. Bird's removal likely occurred around the middle stage of the game's development. It wasn't an incomplete late-stage addition which was abandoned at the last minute, nor was it created super early and went unused. Even if we assume that every special type was created before Bird, it is impossible for Bird to have been created last, because being ID number 6 meant that 2 types were created after it. The latest possible point for Bird's creation would have been around the same time as as bug and ghost, with all of them getting added in the same batch of data. This placement might be a hint as to why bug and ghost were so half-baked, with barely any moves of their respective types and buggy type interactions which were corrected in the subsequent generation. If they were created later than the other types, then it was possible that their move lists weren't planned as thoroughly as the others. An alternative possibility is that all these types were added into the data at the same time, which is possible, but I personally consider it to be less likely, since when is everything ever so nicely prepared during the early development phase? Regardless, if Bird was abandoned early, it would have been removed outright instead of leaving its slot intact. Bird's ID continuing to exist implies that it was removed at a point where enough development had taken place that removing data would have been deemed risky. So now we know it wasn't removed too early, nor was it removed too late. Cool, what does that mean? Well, that tells us that the developers' initial concepts were made with Bird in mind as part of the game, and that something later made them change their minds and the game's design as a result. It is likely that the prototype or alpha versions of mundane birds like Pidgey, Spearow, Farfetch, and Doduo were conceived as bird type. Maybe flightless birds like Doduo were intended to be mono bird or bird normal, and flying birds like Pidgey and Spearow were intended to be, well, flying bird. In this hypothetical what if, flying would have been intended for anything with wings that could fly, such as Charizard, Zubat, Dragonite, Cypher, and so on, whereas bird was exclusively intended for birds, regardless of flight capability. So all birds being converted to flying suggests that the two concepts were combined into one for some reason. Said reason is likely due to bird being not just redundant, but an active detriment to creature design in some way. All the birds mentioned previously are relatively grounded and plain, but what about something more fantastical? What about a flying magical bird with elemental powers? What type would Zapdos be? Electric bird or electric flying? Articuno, ice bird or ice flying? Moltres, fire bird or firefly? This all sounds silly, but it's important for players to be able to reasonably guess a Pokemon's type at a glance. Remember that back then, Pokemon was a brand new RPG with 150 different creatures and 15 different types, with kids as its target audience. So the game needed to be designed such that players could figure things out on their own without external assistance. Also, this was the 90s, so we couldn't just casually look up guides online or be bombarded with gameplay streams from TikTok or social media. Kinda miss those simpler days a bit. Anyways, if bird and flying were different types, they'd have different type interactions. So having almost every bird Pokemon also look like a flying Pokemon would lead to confusion and misplays. And a Pokemon which is a flying bird with an element would make for even greater confusion. Even if the developers made these three birds into special exception cases due to being legendary, they likely realized this problem would still exist for every new fantastical bird they'd create in future. Would Ho-Oh be fire flying or fire bird? What about Xatu or Delibird or Lugia? Is Lugia a bird? It has wing hands? If we need to ask this question for every single elemental flying bird, it'd be best to just rip out the source of the problem entirely and combine the two concepts. Better to make Doduo the sole odd exception case than to make every other bird into an exception case. After that, Bird's data was wiped and it was banished to the depths of the game's code, never to see the light of day again, until a certain infamous glitch called it out. To explain it simply, Missingno exists because older games lack the data protections we have today. Modern game engines will automatically stop if the game detects something has gone wrong. That's why computer programs crash. It's an emergency shutdown. Additionally, older games had smaller file sizes to work with, so they were often forced to store the data for multiple unrelated game elements in the same location. Modern games now have the luxury of keeping data independent. This means a player can mess up the data for one section of the game by meddling with another. When the game gets instructed to access that data, it will proceed to do so as best as it can using whatever data it found, and the system will not automatically crash because it doesn't have the ability to check if something has gone wrong. This produces unpredictable behavior such as glitched enemies or locations, or the game getting caught in an infinite loop loop and subsequently freezing. Missingno is an example of the former case. It's a missing number. During the Viridian City catching tutorial, the player's name is temporarily replaced by Old Man. This name is temporarily stored in the same location as tall grass encounter data, which is normally replaced when entering a route. However, this data is not wiped when entering cities. This normally causes no issue because cities have no grass encounters anyway. They only have surfing and fishing encounters, which use a different set of data. But due to a programming error, the water tiles in Cinnabar Island were accidentally assigned to tall grass. That means when the player goes to Cinnabar and surfs, the game attempts to fetch the encounter data but finds the player's name instead, and instead of stopping, it will proceed to try and spawn a Pokémon which corresponds to the player's name. Unless the IDs for this Pokémon happen to match an already existing Pokémon and sprite somewhere in the game files, the game will produce this mess in its attempt to display something. Now, why does it call out the type data for specifically bird? Well, that I leave to you to find out. This is as far as my knowledge on this glitch goes, and that isn't the point of this video anyway. At any rate, I suppose it is appropriate for a Pokémon who never was to be the sole owner of the type that never was. Bird stuck around for Gen 2, likely because there were a ton of other higher priority issues which need fixing. Missingno aside, Bird was just harmless leftover data which no part of the game could access, so there's nothing wrong with leaving it alone for the time being. It was better to change the water tiles to the correct encounter table and therefore fix the Missingno glitch itself rather than mess with the type data, especially since they were already adding 2 new types in this generation. Don't wanna risk messing those up. Bird's proper removal had to wait until Gen 3, when technological improvements pushed the developers to overhaul their game's code and data structure to make it compatible with the GBA's newer formats. At this point, the developers seem quite satisfied with the type system. They've decided they weren't going to add any new types for a while, 10 years at least. So they cleaned up their data, removing all the unused and abandoned IDs, and built what would go on to be the series' foundational data structure for the next several generations. Thus ends the story of Bird. It's little more than a footnote in the grand scheme of the Pokémon franchise, but its existence is one of the few remnants of Red and Blue's early development we still have today, and that makes it worth acknowledging as a type. At least, in my eyes, technicality though that might be. That's it for this video. If you thought this was flying, well, wait and hope, I guess. This was originally supposed to be part of the script for flying, but there was so much bird that I decided to just make it a separate video. I'll get flying done sooner or later. In the meantime, our next video will be on fish, so look forward to that.